Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, Mysterious Voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, so I want to talk about an intriguing poem that I found recently, and it is also the period of Pride, where I get to talk about LGBTQA plus poets, today I have a good one. Today's poem is all about modernity and human connection. I am referring to It Is Impossible to Be Private Modernly by Kyle Dacuyan. For those who don't know, Kyle Dacuyan is, if I'm pronouncing that last name correctly, he is an American writer who has been getting their work published for about 10 or so years. They identify as queer, but I don't know where in the LGBTQA they necessarily fit, as I haven't found a lot of information about that. But because they identify as queer, I am cataloging them here to talk about them. Their poetry often focuses on modernity, civic life, human connection, things like that. Kyle is heavily involved in the LGBT community. I found an article where he and a couple of his associates were starting a nightclub in New York City, I think, that focused on LGBT individuals. So that's really cool. That's not a lot of the people that I've talked about on this channel have done such things. And it provides a new space, a new opportunity for human connection that might not have existed before. And Kyle is heavily involved in activism in many ways as well. So pretty interesting. Their poetry is really fascinating. It doesn't follow the typical style that you might see or might have seen in the past. It's contemporary, very similar to that of the slam poets, or not slam poems, but that kind of school of thought. At least what I've found so far. Pretty interesting poet. But without further ado, let's talk about It Is Impossible to Be Private Modernly. And I'll read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we'll move on from there. It is impossible to be private modernly. It amazes me the Midas hustle to make anything a job, so long as you have the gumption. And by gumption I mean the means. My lover has a friend, and by friend I think he means a former lover, who was a phone sex operator for men into tickle porn, which I guess means men who get off on the illusion of the most primal laughter. I have a friend myself who writes scene-by-scene synopses of films, like Cliff Notes, I guess, for students who don't want to watch movies, but still need to know about them. It is counterintuitive to me that in the age of mechanical reproduction, the reproduction would be words neither comforting nor disturbing. I acknowledge that everything we have is a simulation of something else, that most work is making content, or a machine, or making other people work. Last night we had dinner with an old friend of my lover's, which I do mean here platonically. She is a woman newly engaged to another woman who is rich enough that I knew not to ask about her work, which is hard. What else is there to talk about with strangers? Thank God all of us are at least gay. Thank God the real friend could tell us about her new enterprise as a lawyer for a cannabis operation selling lollipops and cookies and the very flower itself. We call it flower here. I love it here. She says everything is legal, and if I want to be alone, I go to the end of my block and am alone. So in terms of analysis, that was it. It is impossible to be private modernly. So there's a fair bit to talk about. The narrator just lamenting the sort of modern state of the world, noting that a lot of people seem to be using shortcuts or don't seem to be engaging with art There's like a Midas hustle, which focuses maybe more on money. Again, Midas is gold, and talking about like someone who's writing cliff notes for books or movies for people who don't want to watch the movies. Which why wouldn't you want to engage in the art? That's kind of strange. And then they talk about how they had dinner with a friend who was rich, and they couldn't really find out about that person, but they're all sort of connected and talking about their new enterprises. Again, the hustle, the focus on money there. And at the end they say, and if I want to be alone, I go to the end of my block and I'm alone, which is an interesting way to end the poem. But again, the poem seems to lament the modern state of the world. I do like how the narrator keeps saying, I have a friend, or an old friend, or something like that, and you keep seeing the narrator say, like, my lover has a friend, and by friend I think he means a former lover, and you keep getting that until you get like to near the end of the poem where they say, last night we had a dinner with an old friend of my lover's, which I do mean here platonically. Now, how would they exactly know that unless they were like really close? But you see that a couple times, so it's like repetition, repeated lines. Maybe that's a huge thing in the LGBT community. I'm not exactly sure. I haven't been in enough relationships to really understand that sort of thing. But the last thing that's worth talking about with this poem is the end. At the end, it says, she says everything's legal, and if I want to be alone, I go to the end of my block and am alone. Now, who exactly is saying that? It's a bit unclear, because if it's saying that she says everything is legal, and if I want to be alone, I go to the end of the block and I'm alone, like maybe that she's going to smoke weed or something like that, or the narrator is saying that, like, if I don't want to be around these people, I can go to the end of my block and be alone that way. However, it does seem contradictory to what the narrator has been saying the whole time and what the title is of the poem. It says that, like, the title is, it is impossible to be private modernly. Okay, so if that's the case, if you want to be alone, you would go to the end of your block. Like, that seems like you're contradicting yourself. Is the narrator lying there and saying they can be alone even though they know that they can't, that someone's going to find out about their business? Or are they still like, do people still know about their business, but it's like they feel like they can be alone? Or it's just the narrator lying. Like, the narrator says it at the beginning, it's impossible to be private, and at the end they're just lying to themselves. Like, it suggests the narrator maybe isn't the most trustworthy. I'm not 100% sure. It's a confusing aspect of the poem, but I urge you, sound off in the comments below if you have something specific you'd like to say there, or if you have a sort of take on or interpretation of what the author is saying. Anyway, those are my thoughts on It Is Impossible to Be Private Modernly. Pretty interesting poem. I think many of Kyle's poems are like that, a little bit difficult to sort of work through at times, but still, like, that you can kind of understand the main point. But poetry should be challenging at times in addition to understandable, which I talk a lot about. Kind of easy to understand, or at least easy for me to understand poems from time to time, but you got to throw in a bit of a confusing one every so often. Again, if you have any thoughts on this, let me know in the comments below. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this poem, or even Poetry Thursday if you want to talk more about poems on here or something like that. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and trying to be private travels. Farewell.